on my screen. I don't know.
Right.
Now it's okay.
Why let's start.
Start.
Recording start হয়ে গেছে।
Okay. So, good afternoon, all. Good afternoon, Sir Abhiroop, sir, and good afternoon, Principal, sir, and all other delegates. On behalf of Department of Economics and IQAC, I welcome you all. And today's topic is empirical issues in economics, and we are very much glad to have Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay of ISI Delhi with us. And now I will request our colleague Srija Patro to give a brief introduction of Sir. Srija, please.
A very good afternoon. And I, Srija Patro, on behalf of Economics Department, Sheikh Anandaram Jakuria College, welcoming all of you to attend today's webinar on empirical issues in economics. To talk about the empirical issues in economics, we have with us Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay. Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay is currently associated as Professor in Economics and Planning Unit, ISI Delhi. His primary specialization in his econometric method applied to topics in the field of education, health, and public policy in developing countries, particularly in India. His recent topics of research includes the impact of NREGS on household indebtedness, how to design the teacher transfer programs, and the impact of distribution of human capital on growth and development. He has published several journals in reputed international journals like Economic Journal, Journal of Development Economics, British Medical Journal, Public Health. Professor Mukhopadhyay has obtained his PhD degree from Pennsylvania State University, and he is also recipient of the Hermes Fellowship from CNRS, France, and the Mohalanavish Gold Medal from Indian Econometric Society. So, without wasting any time, I would like to request to propose a welcome address to our principal, sir, Professor Ashok Mukhopadhyay. So,
Thank you, Professor Patro. On behalf of the college, I welcome Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay. I'm absolutely delighted that we are sharing the platform. Sir, you know we are undergraduate college, and you may be accustomed with the PG teaching, and you are very much acclaimed speaker too. And I congratulate at the same time the faculties of economics who have taken up this initiative of doing this webinar, this particularly this time of lockdown, and there must be some interactions among the students. I believe the senior teachers, I can see Professor Nandita Chakraborty is there, Professor Joydeep is there, and many students of our college of different shifts, and probably some students from other colleges too have joined while Professor Abhiroop will be delivering his lecture. Sir, it becomes imperative that we have to say one, two things regarding the, in order to inaugurate such program. And you know that I'm from a commerce stream, and what happens when the experts come, we feel like a patient before a doctor. And especially at this time of my career, at the end of my career, I really wonder that what I have learned and what I have unlearned. Well, I can give you, if you give me the chances to say something of my experience and my understanding of this world of economics, not in your way, but in my way, that when we started studying economics in our school days, my cousin Dada, he was a college teacher. He gave me a puzzle that, Ashok, you try to solve this puzzle, that a country is poor because it is poor. I thought that he must be mad. He was from Presidency College, and probably he was not correct. And then I completed the career, and still at this time, I mean, especially this Corona period, when we are talking about the medicine sans borders, borderless doctors, I'm not sure whether we really understood the point that some 100 years back, the development economists say that a country is poor because it is poor, whether a country should be poor because it is poor. This is number one thing. And number two is that I have a prized possession of a book, Crowther's An Outline of Money. It was studied by my father in his BCom days and in graduation days. And I feel it is a prized possession. While reading through the pages of Crowther's Outline of Money, she was talking about the barter system in East African countries, a pre-war book, they call it, where a hunting knife can be exchanged for some 3 to 4 or 10 goats, and a calmly soft wife can be exchanged for 6 to 7 goats. It was published sometime in 1940. It is a possession of mine. When we started our career in teaching, we started to quote from Crowther that money was the fundamental discovery of economics. In our times, we had some, fascinating characters in economics. The teachers or professors or authors. And one of them was Kenneth Boulding. So Kenneth Boulding was very American economist, and he was very serious about the ecology, the sustainable development, etc., etc. And I collected one particular quotation from him, that he was very much against the tramp of specialization. And at one point he was saying, I would like to quote here, that physicists only talk to physicists, economists to economists, worse still, nuclear physicists only talk to nuclear physicists, and econometricians to econometricians. They talk in a private language what they can understand. So I do not know, and in that case, we feel little tired that we'll be talking about something, and we will go on learning something which we may not know the languages, in what languages they will be delivering the lectures. That is a world of specialization. And also I would like to quote one more classical, a book of, in our times we gone through, that was Mackenzie and Tulloch. Mackenzie and Tulloch. We had it from the American Library. The entire thesis of the new world of economics experience, exploration into our human experience, etc. The entire thesis of Mackenzie Tulloch rests on one issue, that we do not know why people behave the way they do. And still I wonder why people behave the way they do, and without knowing why people behave the way they do, the economists are now giving you the ways, because the shape of the country, or how the country should run. Without the dependency, the countries are dependent on its machinery, state machinery, rules, and everything. Without that, how can science, economics as science can give you the lessons all over the world, students all over the world, and that is a thing that has to be learned from you people. Now, I would like to conclude this particular talk again with the same author bolding, while you were saying that the knowledge can be gained by orderly loss of information. So, sir, we are waiting that how much information will be lost in gaining the knowledge that will be given by you. With these 2-3 words, I would like to welcome Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay to share his thoughts and give the lecture. And I also again tender my thanks to the senior teachers of economics department and the students who have joined this seminar. Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your thoughts. Now the stage is yours to our dedicated guest, Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay. Sir.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank Professor Mukhopadhyay, the economics department, Jaipur College, the department for actually inviting me. I'm very humbled by your invitation. Let me respond very quickly to some of the points made by Professor Mukhopadhyay. So indeed, I will not be talking about bolding and larger ideas. And there's a reason for that. And I think that, I think my talk, blends very nicely into, from this perspective. So I think at some point, in the descriptions and narratives of development, of growth, of progress, we have realized that, we can come up with conceptual frameworks to understand, what is happening and what will probably happen based on that. But many of these conceptual frameworks are based on some assumptions, some priors we have about the world. And it is also the truth that at some point we have realized that some of these conceptual frameworks, which were held as gospel truth, have actually not given rise to situations that our predictions said would happen, which has taken us back to reconsidering many of these assumptions we had, many of the perspectives we had. And one of the perspectives that that we have imbibed as a field of economics is to think a little bit about, not think about the whole narrative as a whole, but to break it up into smaller parts and to seek evidence for various subparts, right? And in this scheme of things, empirical work comes in terms of making very gradual movements, making a statement, checking whether that statement is true or false to the best of our knowledge, and then moving ahead and building on that framework and trying to push it a little more to ask, okay, what will happen if this happens? So it's a very gradualist framework, and it is largely because of the failure at some point of the larger conceptual frameworks, like as you pointed out, that the poor will remain poor. These are very philosophical statements, and a lot of people have pondered about these things, but ultimately this pondering has not given rise to solutions of problems. So how do you make people less poor if you really wanted to do something about it? And that has led to a lot of empirical analysis, which is backed by some policy work. So my talk today will largely focus on this empirical exercise, right? And the tools for this empirical exercise. So I recognize that I may be talking to people of various, various levels of understanding. So I'm going to start from right at the beginning. I'm going to start at what I will call, so it's an empirical issues in economics for sure, but I will start with the ABC of looking at it. When we specialize, we get used to jargons, and sometimes demystifying these jargons is a step towards enlightenment, right? Because you don't want to get scared when you hear people say big things. Most sensible things are actually just sensible. We have a lot of words for them which sound technical, but at the end of it, they are simple ideas. And I hope that I will be able to drive across some of these ideas today as I give my talk. My talk is a little long, but I'll try to cut down, so you might see me skip slides in the middle. Usually when I present to an audience, I always say, stop me wherever you feel necessary. But in such an audience, I think with so many people on Zoom, that might be impractical. So let's leave the questions to the end. I'm happy to take them at the end of the talk. So let me go to my presentation. So as I said, I'm going to basically be talking about empirical issues in economics, but I'm going to start from the ABC of something called causal analysis, right? Sometimes I presented this work and students have typed it out as, declared it, announced it as casual analysis. I can reassure you that there is nothing casual about it, but it's not that tough either. Okay, so let me start with something that was very popular some years back on Twitter. This is basically two maps of UK with with their counties, and on the left is a vote, basically results of the vote to leave the European Union. So the blue is those where majority said leave, and the yellow is where the majority said remain within the European Union. And on the right side, you see in a different color, this is BSE, which is mad cow disease, the incidence of mad cow disease. And the areas that are dark are those where mad cow disease incidence is high, and the lighter ones are where it was free of mad cows, right? When this particular tweet came out, it kind of went viral. And a lot of people said, well, it's basically people who've gone crazy, right? The association of the word mad cow with madness was picked up by some people. And they said, well, this mad cow disease essentially caused people to go crazy, and they all voted to leave the European Union. Okay. So you can see that in such a, scenario, you can easily ask what's called a causal question, which is, did mad cow disease cause people to vote to leave, right? And you can, hypothesize about this kind of question. What we will ask today is not going to be so, to some extent not too trivial. In reality, this was actually an apocryphal figure. This is, if you look at it very closely, it's actually the same figure, just in different colors. So someone had played a prank and put it up. It was amazing that it generated as much, social media attention as it did. But it's very, very tempting for all of us to attribute directional flows from something to something else, right? Because a directional flow is an explanation, right? And as humans, as people who are interested to know why, we always want to know, why a particular thing happens. And whenever you want to know why a particular thing happens, you have an idea of a directional reason, right? Why a particular thing happens. So in this particular sense, economics is full of such problems where we are trying to learn directional flows. Okay, so I'm going to motivate today with the whole thing in a context, because I could give you a lot of theory and statistics and economic concepts, but actually all these things can be explained in very easy ways if you think about a context. So the context I will choose is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. It's not so important that you know anything about it. It's just going to be some context. I will give you one or two facts. You don't need to know more than that. Okay, I'm sure many of you, especially studying economics, are aware that this was a public workfare program which offered some wages to do work in villages of India. Okay, so I'm going to motivate essentially a context using this particular scheme, and you can see that a question, a causal question, a directional question, is of a lot of relevance because you want to know if a scheme like this has done something. So there is a, you care about the direction. So how do we see this? So, when we look at data, we have some important concepts that I want to bring to fore. Many of you know these as part of your statistics course. We're going to talk about the role of variation and covariation. They're very simple concepts. For the first time when I learned these things, I glossed over them as one of those formulaic things that you learn in statistics, which is just to pass an exam. So it's only later that you will see, that I saw, and hopefully you'll see today, that these are very fundamental concepts of how you can get at some of these questions. Then I'll talk a bit about experimental design in economics, which is a very important part of empirical work, which kind of makes it very similar to scientific kind of research. Okay, and then we can follow that up with questions. So what do I need you to know today? For this particular talk about this scheme? Not much. I expect you to know that this is, I don't expect you to, it's not really important that you know it's called Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. I'll call it NREGS. It's a name. It's a workfare program, and it legally entitles rural households to at least 100 days of unskilled manual labor on public projects at prefixed wage. Okay, that's a self-targeting thing. The idea is that you don't have to identify the poor identify themselves because they are the only ones who land up for such work like digging roads and ditches at a low wage. Okay, so in the village, if you have a scheme like this and you open up to everyone, you're going to get the poor people landing up for work, and therefore you would have helped them without moving through an identification process, which is often political and fraught with mistargeting. The second fact that I want you to know about this particular scheme is that this scheme was introduced in a staggered manner in India. So it first went to the 200 most backward districts of India in 2006, then the next best districts in 2007, and then it was made universal in 2008. Right? So these are two facts. I will not use them for the first half of my talk, but I want you to know that these are what this particular scheme is about. This talk is not about NREGA or NREGs, so you don't need to know more than that. So I mean, just a visual characterization of where. So the red one is the phase 1 districts, 2 is when it came later, and 3 is when it came last. So of course, there's an important policy question, and it's a question that you can either talk in terms of policy, or you can even talk in terms of more fundamental things like does opportunity to work lower poverty in India, right? Or you can ask the policy driven question, which the government may be interested in, which is the NREGs lower poverty in India, right? So the only other fact I would like you to know is that poverty is measured in terms of consumption expenditure, usually in terms of some threshold expenditure that you measure if the household consumes at least that much. It's not so important for my talk. I will refer to consumption expenditure at various points and call it poverty, and therefore I'm putting it there. It's not so important that we precisely define this. Okay, so let's move to the first concept of how do we go about answering this kind of a, right? Notice that it's a very direct.
Sir,
yes.
You have not probably shared your screen. Your PPT is not visible.
I thought I did. Oh, okay, there is some error. So I'm sorry. Let me stop sharing. Start sharing again. Entire screen. Share. Okay, is my screen visible now? Okay, it's coming. I'm sorry, I should have noticed this. Okay, can everyone see my screen now?
Yes, it's coming.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I should have pointed that out earlier, but it's okay. I think I said fairly general things, which are, I mean, I'm just reading.
Yes, right. Now it's that's
okay. All right. So we want to ask this kind of question. So it's obvious that this is a directional question. Did NREGs lower poverty? So we are basically positing a pathway of change that goes from the opportunity to work on poverty. So if you didn't see so here's one slide I showed, which is I couldn't have explained. So this is basically the staggering of districts in India The red one is where it comes first, then the orange one, and then the yellow ones. Okay. So the first concept I want all of you to focus on is the concept of variation and covariation. Okay. And so how does data help us understand, to begin with, associations between variables? So to answer this particular question that I have posed, first, there should be variation or at least differences across people in both the NREG's income as well as consumer expenditure, for sure, in terms of NREG's income, right? Because if no one was earning, then how could I even ask whether NREG's makes a difference or not? Because no one actually works on it. And if everyone worked on NREG's, then so if people work, so everyone works on NREG's. So how should I be able to say whether it made a difference or not? Okay, so we would require some variation. That means we would require some differences between people, some of whom who work on NREG's and get NREG's income, and those who don't. Okay, so that's the first thing. So in any empirical exercise, if you do not have variation in your data, differences across what you're studying, then you cannot pose a question. That's a very important part of understanding data. Then the next important statistical concept is that of covariance, right? And covariance, just to, I'm not going to define anything in this talk. Let's take two variables. Again, this NREG's income and consumer expenditure. Let's say as one goes up on an average, the other one also goes up. It moves in the same direction, right? So we all know this, we use this kind of analysis. We call it sometimes correlation, but the fundamental object is covariance. The idea is they co-vary. That means they vary together, right? And in other words, if when one goes up, the other one goes up as well. When we get something like this, we say, well, there's positive covariance. We also say there's positive correlation, which is just derived object from this covariance, right? So this is the second object, but this is an object that we use as the second important tool. Okay, that's all I require in terms of tools. Okay, now the question is, as we saw in the previous slide, suppose the correlation between household income from NREG's and consumer expenditure is positive, right? So that means if one moves up, the other moves up also. Now consider, given this particular fact, following statements that all of us would like to make, based on this particular observation on the correlation. We can say, well, households have higher NREG's income spend more on consumption. We could also say households that have higher consumption expenditure also have higher NREG's income. Some people might even say higher NREG's income leads to more expenditure on consumption. But we could also say better consumption expenditure leads to better NREG's income. Yeah, maybe you eat better, therefore you can work and you go out to work on NREG's projects. Now, here's another data representation of those same, the same statement. So these are stark examples. Assume that there are, in the world, two households, A and B. Economists love these apples and oranges, A and B kind of comparisons, conceptual. Hopefully they will drive home the point. So the household A has 0 NREG's income, so it doesn't work, and has the expenditure of 500. The other household has NREG's income of 1,000 and has a consumer expenditure of 700. So this would give you a positive correlation between the two, right? Now, these four statements, as some of you may have already noted, are actually statements of different texture, meaning, and a very fundamental concept, right? So the first two statements, which is that households that have higher NREG's income spend more on consumption, and households that have higher consumption have higher NREG's income, are of course correct, but they don't point out any directional flow. They're just descriptions of the world. It means that if you go to someone's household and you find that his income is higher, NREG's income is higher, he's likely to also be consuming more, right? It doesn't say that that's the cause for it. It just says that, there is just this particular descriptive, right? And so these two statements are perfect statements to make based on the data we have. The question is, We are not interested in that, because we are not interested in just finding out who is, who's got a higher consumption. In fact, going back to the slide, if you were interested purely in prediction, that is, you wanted to know, whose consumption is higher. Well, this information might be useful, right? It may be difficult for us to do, to calculate a lot of data by asking questions about people's consumption. And, you could substitute that by just going to a household and saying, do you have a higher index income? And he said, okay, you have like 1,000 rupees, okay. And then you come out and you say, well, you have 1,000 rupees income, so you must have higher consumption, because I know that those two things are positively correlated. So sometimes this kind of description of the world can lead to good predictive models. And in fact, the whole area of machine learning is essentially around this fact, where we are trying to throw a lot of things together, trying to predict things. But prediction does not mean that there are directional relationships. Okay, this statement here, that higher index income leads to more expenditure, is a stronger statement, because it basically means that that by giving index you can lower poverty. Similarly, if you made the other statement, that is, higher consumption expenditure leads to higher index income, you could get that in the data. It could be that you go to a village of India, there are some fairly rich landed people, and their consumption is higher, and because of tremendous corruption in many villages of India, they are able to get bank accounts and get false transfers of index funds, so they will also have higher index income. So they will not work, but they could have higher income just because of corruption, right? So that's a very strong statement, that higher consumption expenditure leads to higher index income. Both statements are strong statements, and statements that can lead to policies, right? So these kind of statements are called causal statements, because so you infer a causal link, that one causes the other. Okay. Now, let's say, suppose, based on whatever we have, this positive correlation, we accept the first statement, that higher index. So, one of the problems of most people in the world is that we actually think we already know what is reality, right? We are typically always looking for, revalidating what we already know. So suppose we believe that index income is very good. Index is there are many activists of index. They believe that index is poverty alleviating, right? So once they see this particular fact, it's very easy for them to say that, look, didn't I tell you index would make all the difference? And they would then, infer and make the first statement. So suppose, I accept the first statement, right? So you're in a party, you're chatting, there's some very left of center person who believes in index, and they say, well, index has made all the difference to poverty in India. Should you accept this particular statement based on the data is positive? So what could be going wrong? Notice that if you accept the first statement, it's a kind of a strong statement, because it means that if you were able to transfer some money to households through index, you should see, fall in poverty, because it should increase consumption expenditure. So it's a strong statement to concede, because it then means that the government can spend more money on particular schemes, or you can think about, what these are called conditional cash transfers. This is conditional on working, you're getting some money. So these are kind of things that there is a lot of lobbying for these kind of schemes. So, they should be able to pressurize public officials to spend more money on these schemes, right? And that comes at a cost, because money is never free. It's always coming from somewhere. So if you look at this evidence and you look at this particular statement, why could we be wrong, right? So to understand why we could be wrong, we should ask ourselves, what is the experiment that we would really want to run to be able to answer this question, right? We would want to answer the following question. Consider a household, imagine it simultaneously in two worlds. One world where it has no index income, and another exactly same world where it has index income, right? So it's you living simultaneously in both the worlds. Then compare the two U's, right? Compare the consumption expenditures of these households, of this household, in both these worlds. if we see that there is a difference in consumption expenditure, in particular, if we see that the household that is living in the world, which has NREX income, has higher consumption, then we will say that this is the impact of NREX. Because why? It's just exactly you, and it's you in both the worlds. So the only difference is NREX income, and therefore, if I see anything different in consumption, it's because of NREX. It can't be because of anything else, right? And so, if you think about it like this, the idea is that of NREX income being a treatment. So you're like a subject, you're living in both the worlds, and you're being treated in one world like a medicine with NREX income, right? In fact, the word treatment does come from medicine. So in one world, you have no treatment, and another world, you have treatment, which is this NREX income. But the problem, and that would be a valid exercise, except that there is only one world, and you cannot observe the same household under both the treatment and no treatment, right? Now, you can say, well, I can always go to the household this year and there was no NREX, and I can go to the household next year and then there is NREX, and I can compare. But wait, one year apart, that's a lot of time. Many things change in the world. The household could have changed, right? So when we say the same household, it means instantly at any given point in time, you're observing the same household in both states of the world, right? Now, of course, it's clear that this is not possible. There are some exceptions, to betray my age. Here's a movie that 99% of you have never watched, but it is a movie worth watching. It's got this guy, Jet Li, who lives in a multiverse. I mean, many physics people believe in this, that there are multiple universes and you can be living in multiple universes. Unfortunately, we don't know of any of these, so I will let go. So this is not true for any human being. Of course, there is one person for which it might be true, and that's Rajnikant. But the world, any policy analysis is about the average citizen and not Rajnikant. So we can discount that too. So we have one word, but to say something about impact, this is precisely what we want to compare. The same household in both states of the world. So we have to find a way out, right? This is a conundrum. We cannot get around it. So let's say, okay, we can't do that. Let us think about another exercise. So suppose we can find another household such that the household has no NREX income, but the household is otherwise exactly like the household that has NREX income, right? So your clone, the clone of your household, right? So let us look at our example again. So suppose this A and B were exactly same in everything except this NREX income, right? Then you can say, well, this difference is because of that. Of course, when you make that statement, you can ask yourself the following question. Household A and B, let's say we're living in the same village. Let's say you contend that they're exactly the same, right? But to earn different levels of NREX income, they have done something different, right? One has worked and the other one has not worked. So if they are the same, how can it be that they have done different things, right? So the natural question is, why do some households receive treatment, which is the NREX income, and others don't? So then you start, you may start with this assumption that both the households are actually the same, but then you have to ask yourself that, no, they cannot be the same. They must be different on something because they are making a different choice. So there must be something about them that is different, right? So more generally, in all this trying to understand the impact of treatments, the problem we suffer from and the question we ask are those who are assigned treatments, those who are working on NREX here, are they similar to those who are not? And as I pointed out, I'll come back to this again. This question, leads to some obvious answers that, of course, probably they are not. Now, let's move to what you would do if you were in some labs, right? You're scientific kind of, as I say, the pure sciences. So your households would be your subjects. You would start with, the word homogeneous here is not required. Let's say you start with some group of households, not too different, but, they are there, maybe in a village. Then we divide them into two groups. right? How do we divide them into two groups? We do it randomly. What does the word randomly mean? It's used very loosely, all over the world. It means different things to different people. In this world of statistics and evaluating empirical, treatments, it means that this division, this which household goes to which group, is done with no prejudice one way or the other, right? So more technically, everyone has an equal chance of being in either group, right? So you just divide these people up into these groups. So one group, do nothing. Second group, give them some NREX income. Just hand them over some money, right? You can ask them to work also. And then observe if they have different expenditures on consumption, right? So this is a slightly different thing to what, this multiverse idea that I pointed out. But how does this help? Well, this particular thing is called randomization. And as we all know, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo got a Nobel Prize for putting forth this way of evaluating things. This is called a randomized controlled trial or randomization. And the idea behind this is, since we did not choose the people systematically to be in one group, which is the NREX group, or the other, which is the non-NREX group, the hope, is that the group with the NREX income, on an average, is not different from the group without NREX income, right? There are all these people. It's almost like you close your eyes, you put half of them in one, you put the half in the other. So you did not use any principle, to separate them out in these two groups. So the idea is that on an average, these groups are very similar. You can check, but the principle basically means that there is no prejudice in those who are in NREX income group versus the other group. Now, if we do so, then on an average, there is no difference between the treated, right, those people in this treated group, and their other world avatars, who are the controls, right, so the other group, right? So now the analysis is not at the individual level. The analysis is at the group level. And the idea is that on an average, these two groups are the same. So if you see any differences in outcome, like consumption expenditure, then what is different between those two groups? Well, the only difference is that one has NREX and the other one does not. So it must be the difference in NREX income that drives the outcome, which is the consumption expenditure. Okay. Now, as I said, this is what's called a randomized controlled trial, and such ways of doing it are called experimental design. You can see how I'm designing, allocations of people in groups. So it's called an experimental design. Now, I'm not going to talk about this at all. I'm sure when Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo and got the Nobel Prize, and Michael Kramer, all of you read newspaper articles and you already know this idea. It's also used now in vaccinations, to figure out if COVID vaccination works or not, right? Put people, give someone placebo, give other people the vaccine, do it randomly so that everyone has equal chance to begin with. And then if you see outcomes, that's because of the vaccine and nothing else. Now, apart from medical science and some questions which are open to this kind of experimentation, you can see that many real life situations in the world are not amenable to such kind of, your experimental kind of tinkering around, right? So, for example, even in the case of NREX, right, the government cannot do that. You cannot allocate people randomly because you know that there are some people who are poor. You want to give NREX to the poor people. You cannot wait till some experiment comes out which says whether NREX is good or bad to then decide, that you give some rich person money whereas the poor person in the same village is sitting. Just happens to be tough luck. You got in the wrong group. There are ethical concerns with such kind of allocation. So on ethical grounds, this kind of experiment cannot be run in things like NREX. Think about things like impact of cancer, impact of HIV/AIDS. Think of now impact of COVID. You cannot randomly select, you cannot create two groups, randomly give people cancer in one and not in the other and say, okay, we will see what happens now, right? These are just not possible to do. But many real life situations are like this, where we have to evaluate these particular kind of questions. So now let's get back to that. Let's say we cannot do these randomized controlled trials. So what can we do? Okay. So one idea that you can do is you can say, well, we know that we cannot live in both the worlds. Maybe we can try to match households, right? Match them in some way to kind of compare likes to likes. So if there's a household that is working on NREX, let me try to find another one which looks very similar in terms of, what I can observe. Now, what dimensions will you compare across? So you can look at various dimensions, right? So you can compare two households with exactly the same education level, same number of children, same village. Think about all the list of things that you can think of, right? And then you can create buckets and say that, look, so this person, this household has this level of income, these many children, he belongs to, particular village. And now let's look at exactly the same profile, but the person doesn't work on NREGs. And let's then compare. So that is a valid comparison, right? And see whether the consumption expenditure varies or not. But you can see very easily that this is impossible to do. Humans are different in so many dimensions, right? A lot of people consider the statisticians and people who do empirical work are naive because for some reason they have variables that they try to measure human beings in, and human beings are so complicated, and every person is different, every household is different, and different in so many dimensions, right? So that is actually a fallacy in the sense that economists or statisticians, in fact, do not do that. Everyone is aware of the fact that it's impossible to do this kind of matching, as humans are different in many, many dimensions. Okay, so we have a tool and the statistical way out, which we call multivariate regressions. Okay, so let's think about what is this idea of multivariate regressions. Now, what tends to happen, and it happened when I was a student too, is that these kind of topics get very quickly mired into some sort of statistical condition, some matrix, some complicated alpha, beta, gamma, and you basically lose the idea of why you are doing what you are doing. So take what I'm doing today as kind of trying to motivate you into understanding why you learn what you learn. Details of course matter, but don't get lost in them. Okay. So before we go to multivariate regressions, let's go back to our problem. So you want to look at the covariation of NREG's income and consumption expenditure. Now let me give you two more facts when comparing the households. Let me bring in the idea of land, and let's say that we know that those who work on NREGs typically have less land, right? They are typically poor. Of course, we also know that those who we'll observe with higher consumption are typically going to be more landed, richer. So now suppose you are comparing the consumption of a household doing NREGs income to one that isn't doing NREGs, right? Now you don't know how much is because of the NREGs work and how much is because their land ownership differ, right? There's another factor here now, land. And land can matter in terms of whether you can consume or not. So how do we know it's about NREGs and not about having more land? In fact, in this analysis, if you ignore the land factor, you may even conclude that NREGs income lowers consumption. Why? Well, because you can see that people who have less land will be poorer and they'll be doing NREGs work. And those who have more land will not be doing NREGs typically, will have higher consumption. And then you will see that those who are not working on NREGs, of course, now have higher consumption. Those who are working on NREGs have lower consumption. And then you will conclude that actually doing NREGs will lower your consumption, right? Absolutely wrong, because there is this land that is floating around that you're not taking into consideration. Okay. Now, when we do regressions and multivariate work, we talk about things like holding land constant. These are in Latin we say ceteris paribus. What does it mean in terms of statistics? And the ideas are very simple. Okay, the idea is the following, and I'm presenting this. Those who want to do corporate work, please be aware. This is exactly what you will see for the rest of your lives. These kind of box diagrams. So if you should try to understand what is happening from this box diagram, because that's what you're going to see for the rest of your life. So here's in a triangle, the consumption expenditure of households. And what I'm going to try to do as the first exercise is I'm going to try to predict how much of the consumption can be predicted by the land that this household has. Okay, so I run some prediction exercise. I could run a bivariate regression, but let's say I do some statistical kind of correlation analysis, and I find the relationship between land and consumption expenditure. So for every unit of, you tell me you have 5 bigas, I can tell you how much consumption is predicted by the amount of 5 biga you have. Okay. Now, once I do the prediction, I subtract out this prediction from my data. Okay. Now that is basically reflected by that, that figure which has this top missing, the pyramid which has this top missing, right? So that's the net consumption. Net consumption means it's the part of consumption that cannot be predicted by the amount of land you have. Okay. Now, in a second exercise for the same households, I do the following. I look at the correlation between NREG's income and land, or I can, in other words, I try to predict how much land can predict the amount of NREG's income you have, right? So again, if you have 5 biga land, then what does it say in terms of a prediction of how much NREG's income you can have, right? It's all based on data. Now, once I predict, I subtract that prediction out of the actual NREG's income that you have, right? That I call on the right net income. Okay. Notice that these two objects, which are smaller than the objects on the leftmost side, are the part of consumption that is, from where I have subtracted out what you can predict using land, and similarly for net income. Now, in my data, if net consumption and net income co-vary, right? So if this particular net consumption, which is, again, remember, where I have removed the impact of land by removing what land can predict. And similarly for net income, if these co-vary, this movement can have nothing to do with land, right? Because I've already removed from each of this part what can be predicted by land. So this part that you see, this correlation that you will see, has nothing to do with the amount of land that the household has. So I'll come back to that idea again, right? But this is exactly what a multivariate regression does. Okay, so when you learn, those who have learned multivariate regression, this is the same thing as running a regression of consumption on NREG's income and taking a control variable like land, right? But that is so opaque because you don't know what you're doing. Essentially, you're doing this, right? It gives you exactly this answer. So in this sense, you can see that what it means is land, the impact of land is being removed from this correlation. So this correlation is not driven by the amount of land that the household has. Now, let's go back again to this lab experiment. So in the lab experiment, if households were guinea pigs, you take two households exactly the same, give one unit higher and measure the impact, right? And as I pointed out, well, to get these two households which match in zillion dimensions, this is not going to be possible. Yeah, each dimension can take large number of unique values. There are thousands of dimensional things. Some of it now we can, look at using machine learning, but typically we are not going to be able to match households. So the multivariate regression is exactly what that, PwC kind of, Pricewaterhouse kind of figure showed you. That is the netting out that we are doing. But once we do with this, you can imagine you can use the same principle, not just for land. You can use it for other things too. You can use it for land, soil quality, household structure. You can, you can ask yourself how much of consumption is predicted by land and soil quality and household structure and number of adults, so on and so forth. Then you can remove this prediction from the actual value, and then what is left then has no connection with all these variables. The only thing then hopefully varying is just index income, right? This concept in statistics is called partial correlation. So when you look at the correlation between two objects, that's called correlation. When you look at this correlation after removing, in statistics we call it partialing out the impact of all these other variables, we call it partial correlation. Okay, and the idea, the statistical idea that we are trying to drive across is that once we have netted out all these observable differences, these land, soil quality, household structure, so on and so forth, then the correlation between net NREG's income and net consumption, right, is net of all these differences. Hence, when we compare the two net quantities of income and consumption, it is as if the households are the same. Okay, so it's not like we are actually creating buckets and matching people. We are using this kind of technique to be able to remove the impact of all these variables. Now, you could end that. A lot of people do that. People do that, and they have a lot of these other variables. They go and try to collect data. But there's a fundamental problem with this. And the fundamental problem with this is that, in fact, most things in life, think about consumption, right? It's a function of not just things that you can observe, but a large host of things in the world that you cannot observe. We call them unobservables in statistics, right? So by definition, unobservables are things that you will never have data on. And how do you match on unobservables? I mean, by definition, it's something that you will never have data on, right? So, for example, in the example I just gave you, with zero income household A and household B, is the household with zero NREGs income the same as the household with positive NREGs income in terms of unobservables? Maybe with observables, we can do the netting out that I showed you in terms of a multivariate regression. But in terms of unobservables, there is nothing to net out because I don't have data. It's by definition something I cannot see, right? So we'll need to frame this in a more precise way to understand the problem. So in my endeavor to remove all kind of Greek Latin from this, this econometrics and statistics, I've written them, but I've written them in English so that they look a little less intimidating. So the typical way the specification we would write to examine this problem is we would regress what we call a dependent variable, which is C, just this consumption that you want to look at, on some parameter A, which is, forget about it, it's some sort of a mean. We want to look at the impact of NREGs income, and then X symbolizes everything else that we can observe about the households, right? The beta and gamma are just reflecting the partial correlation. That means the impact of 1 unit more of NREGs income on consumption is beta, right? Whatever you get as your estimate of beta. Now, of course, in this equation, you see there is a plus U, right? And this is the starting point of statistics. So I feel a little, amused when people say that quantitative people don't understand the complexities of life and not able to take into account all the idiosyncrasies of human nature. Of course we do. That's UI, right? It's everything about consumption, everything that affects consumption on which I don't have data. That's UI, right? And so it's of course relevant for consumption. So to be able to ask ourselves what happens when we change NREGs income, right? We will have to estimate the true impact of 1 unit more of NREGs income, right? So that's the beta. Ceteris paribus, which means that everything else the same. So how do we do everything else the same? Note that we have this partialing out logic that I just gave you, right? This netting out. So yeah, we have data on X. We can, using the procedure I just kind of described, we can partial out the impact of X. So that X is not the reason why, NREGs income and consumptions co-move, right? But we still have these unobservable things to contend with. So we ask ourselves, when will be the estimated beta, this particular impact of NREGs that we are estimating, be in fact the correct impact of NREGs income, right? The true impact that we actually is true in the world. So for this, we need a particular condition to be true, which is in some sense very intuitive, right? When we consider two groups of households, one with NREGs income, 1 rupee different. So you're trying to find out the impact of 1 rupee NREGs income. So think about two groups of households or two households which have NREGs income but 1 rupee apart, right? 1 rupee difference. So when we are comparing these two households, there should be nothing about them that I can't observe, which is this UI. Should be nothing about them that I can't observe. That systematically changes at the same time, right? So if the household with 1 rupee income was systematically different in some ways that mattered for consumption, then I'm not picking up the impact of NREGs income. I'm picking up the impact of NREGs income and this other thing that is systematically different about the household, right? So for us to say that it's not because of that other thing which I don't observe, what must be true is that the unobservable should not systematically change with the changes in NREG's income. Okay, so one way of stating that statistically is that the correlation between NREG's income and the unobservable should be zero. Okay, there should be no statistically kind of some statistical correlation between the two. They should not systematically correlate. But you see, now we can make that assumption, but we are basically down to the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is, of course, it's very nice to make that statistical statement that NREG's income and what I don't see about the world should not systematically correlate. But how do I check that? Because it's unobservable. So we cannot check that condition with the data. We cannot say, oh, this is the data on UI, and you just see if there's a correlation or not. We can't do that. It's a conceptual problem. We cannot do this particular exercise. And that is the problem of causal analysis of policy, right? Typically, we want assignment into a treatment, and whether you're an NREG's worker or not. Typically, such assignments always depend on unobserved characteristics of the unit. That means if you're studying, if someone studies science as compared to commerce, do they get more or less? But studying science and commerce is not a random kind of thing. Of course, people who study science are a different kind of people than people who study commerce. So how do you know later that if they have different incomes, it's because of science and not because of the person who's different, who has self-selected himself or herself or itself into particular streams, right? So this is a very conceptual problem, that assignment, which is being part of a particular treatment, depends always on unobserved characteristics, right? So you can fundamentally ask your question, why one household works on NREGs and the other one doesn't, right? And of course, the problem is, as I pointed out, the first feature of the scheme, households self-select into NREGs work. Your answer can be, okay, if they self-select, I can account for that. I can account for that by netting out the unobservables, the observables, right? Their land, their education, and so on and so forth. But the question is much more fundamental, because your answer can be, they're different. I'm accounting for them by including these observable characteristics and netting it out. But then the question comes again, if they're both same on observable characteristics, then why does one household work and the other one does not, right? They're making different choices. So it's obvious that they are fundamentally or in some ways different. And because they are different, it's, controlling for observables will never be enough for any impact evaluation. So many people run multivariate, multivariate regressions. It's a very strong statistical tool, but it belies one of these fundamental things, that it doesn't go beyond the test of common sense, that if you're trying to look at the impact of something and you're netting out everything else to make the household the same, then why should the household differ in only that one particular thing that you want to examine? Cannot be. If they're the same, then they should be doing the same thing. So it means obviously that they are different. And now the question is, if I observe differences in consumption, how do I know it's this one thing that I'm looking at that is causing it and not this other thing which I cannot see, but which is true in the world? Hence, we need an experimental design. Okay, so I'll go on for, I think I started at 3:10, so I'll go on for 5-7 more minutes. Is that okay?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an idea, just a flavor of what experimental design is. And experimental designs are of many kinds. In fact, one of the main things that empirical researchers do is not to do a regression. Regression anyone can do. You can learn a package. You can, you learn how to, regress one variable on the other. You can learn some formulas, right? But just learning formulas does not mean that you leave your common sense on the side. You still have to think with common sense. So a lot of what empirical economists do is try to come out with experiments, ways of designing things which will give you this particular causal impact that you can then, inform either policymakers or inform the particular field of study itself. Okay. So I'm going to talk about something called a difference in difference. Right? It sounds very heavy, but you will see the idea is very simple. The first thing that is required for experimental design is to give up the pretense that you can construct households exactly the same in the same village, in the same district, exactly household same, but one does NREGs and the other one does not. In the different choices that they have, they reveal themselves to be different. So just give up this pretense that you can actually construct, you can find two households which are exactly the same. So here's an experiment that I'm suggesting, and this requires fact 2 that I gave you. Okay. So what is fact 2? Fact 2 is basically the idea that the particular scheme of interest is staggered over time. So so again, just let's go back and remind ourselves. In 2007, according to what I said, on an average, households that live in phase 1 district, which is the most backward districts, let's compare these guys to those who live in phase 2 districts, right? Which are slightly less backward. Okay. Now, it is possible that there are households who are actually similar in living in both kinds of districts. It's just that NREGA has not come to phase 2 districts. That's why they're not working on NREGA. It's not a choice. It's just that there is no NREGA in their district, right? Whereas in phase 1, because there is NREGA, there is a household that works. But it is possible conceptually that there can be two households who are exactly the same. One that works and one that does not work, right? Just because in one district there is already the scheme is working, in the other it's not working. So the idea is compare observationally similar households, but between two districts, right? And compare them irrespective of whether they work on NREGA or not, right? So first, we have to give up on this thing that we can actually figure out what is the impact of working on NREGA, because we see that the act of working itself declares you to be someone different, right? So let's ask ourselves that, okay, there are populations living in these two kinds of districts. On an average, do this district where there is NREGA, how is that doing in terms of the other district where NREGA is not doing, right? So their district location is what determines whether they are in the treated group, which is the group that got NREGA, or in the untreated group, which is the district that didn't get NREGA. Okay, but of course this is not enough, because now you see that if phasing, because you're comparing populations in these two different kinds of districts, right? But these districts are again not random; they are phased. So if phasing depends on district backwardness, that can make the populations in this district different, right? So then give up the idea that you can actually compare the populations at a given point in time across the two districts, because these districts are so different. Instead, compare the changes in each district over time. So what are we going to do? So let's do an example. So suppose this is in 2005, there is no NREGA in the world. The average consumption of households in phase 1 district is 50 rupees. I'm just giving you some number. They don't have any correlation. They are reality. Though 50 rupees is not too bad in 2005. Many poor households actually had per capita consumptions like that. NREG's phase 2 districts, they are richer. Remember, they are less backward. They have a consumption of 100. Okay. Now, in this world, 2005, there is no NREGA anywhere. Okay. So you see, it satisfies the condition. So if you, of course, you cannot compare phase 1, phase 2, because obviously they are different kinds of districts. Right. So phase 1 is poorer. Now in 2006, imagine what happens because of staggering. NREGs kicks in 2006 in phase 1 districts, and in phase 2 districts, because it's still not time, there is still no NREGs, right? And suppose their consumptions change like this. For phase 1 district, the consumption goes up by 25. In phase 2 district, the consumption goes up by 10, right? So what's the change for phase 1 district? It's 25, right, between 2006 and 2005. And for phase 2 district, the change is 10. So we contend that the impact of NREGs on an average is 15 rupees, right? So that's 25 minus 10. So first, why just to correlate it to what I meant, this is you can see it's a difference in difference, because first I took the difference between 2006 and 2005, right? And that's 25 rupees and 10 rupees for phase 2 districts. And then now I'm taking a difference of the difference, the 25 minus 10. And so it's 15. So why am I subtracting 10? I'm subtracting 10 because, look, I'm looking at a different year, right? 2006. And, without NREGA also, this district would have changed. It wouldn't have remained at 50. It would have made some changes. There would have been some rise in consumption. India was growing at that time. So we are assuming that the NREG's phase 1 districts would have shown the changes just like phase 2 districts, right? Had there been no NREGA, right? So it's as if the phase 1 districts would have got 10 anyways, because of, for various reasons. So what is the extra that they got because of NREGs? Well, it's 25 minus 10, which is 50. So that's the impact of NREG. Now, is that a reasonable assumption? Well, we need to check that. But however, we can do that, right? Is this a reasonable assumption? Suppose we can show the following. We can show that before 2005, if we plotted the time series of how consumption changes, we observe that, of course, phase 1 districts are poorer than phase 2 districts. You can see that any year the consumption in phase 1 district is lower than phase 2 districts. However, the annual changes before NREGs kicked in were more or less the same across the 2 districts, right? Is this right? Well, we can check. It's an assumption that can be checked in data, right? Suppose we could actually show that. Well, then the question is, well, they were evolving at the same rate before NREGs. Why should anything be different later, right? So it shouldn't be. If there was no NREGs in both the districts, both of them would have grown at the same rate. So now, assuming that 10 rupees, they would have grown by 10 rupees. It's not a leap of faith. They were doing the same before. So why shouldn't they be doing the same later? It's a reasonable assumption, right? However, now because of NREGs, this phase 1 district grew even faster than 10. By how much? By 15. And why? Because of NREGs, right? So this is what's called a pre-trend parallel trends analysis. So it's called a test for parallel trends, right? Because there are 2 parallel, so the rate of change is the same. So if we are able to show that, in fact, before the policy kicked in, both the kind of districts were actually evolving in the same way, then it is reasonable to assume that they would have. And now, if you observe a change that is different, right? So here's basically diagrammatically, this is the phase 1 district. It changes by a lot. The phase 2 district is changing in some rate. The idea is that it would have changed by that much anyways, right? Just like phase 2 districts. So what is left must be because of NREGs. Okay? So you see, this is the idea that is acknowledging the fact that households can be different. It's acknowledging the fact that we cannot compare households with NREGs and without NREGs. It is taking all that into account. It is trying to construct an experiment with some validation to be able to tell you what is the causal impact of NREGs. Now, this is one example of how this can be done. There are many such interesting examples, of ways to set up experiments to be able to do, valid causal analysis. And if you do a master's degree, a lot of these courses are about trying to construct these kind of experiments. These experiments come through a lot of reading of context, reading of methods to find out. But it's essentially a scientific set. There's no routine like formulaic thing. It's your creativity on how you can design the experiment. So an economics empirical research is about searching for some experiments, such experiments, right? Of course, you can be Abhijit Banerjee and Duflo and induced experiments by doing randomized controlled trials, but that's not the only way to do experiments. You can also search for these kind of experiments. And of course, you would need data to tease out effects. And now I've talked here about, policy, but in fact, this is true to be able to estimate the, any economic model. Yeah? What's the impact of working on, on children's education? You could construct examples like this. And in fact, economists do that all the time to be able to talk about causal analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the simple analysis that will be helpful for us. Now, I would like the audience, if you have any question, you can ask it directly. Is there any questions?
It's a lot. I guess people are like, it was in the afternoon. So.
Is there any question, participants? Okay. So there is no question.
That's fine. So I would encourage all of you to, to read more. There are lots and lots of these impact evaluation, causal papers. They're very simple in ideas. And, to consider doing a master's degree to learn much more about this. I would have loved undergraduate courses to cover more of these, but, I know that there are a lot of things to teach as, it's a very watered down version. So there are many preliminaries that need to be taught to understand this. So, but I encourage most people to learn more so that you can engage with the world.
Okay. So now, if there is no question, so I would like Professor Gautam Bhattacharya to give the vote of thanks. Sir?
Am I audible, Sriya?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay. Good evening, viewers. We have come to the concluding part of today's program. So I, Gautam Bhattacharya, on behalf of the Department of Economics, taking the opportunity to extend my thanks to all of you present here right now. So first of all, I want to convey my special thanks to our very, very respected guest, very, very respected guest come speaker, Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay, ISI Delhi, for his outstanding speech. Sir, you have accepted our invitation and we are really privileged. At the same time, we have, along with you, we have passed a very quality time. It's really your discussion has helped us to a great extent to learn so many things regarding the econometrics, regarding the empirical findings in statistics, what is the relation between statistics and economics. It has been very nicely explained by you. Thank you so much, sir, for your outstanding participation. Another special thanks I should give to our very respected principal, sir, Dr. Ashok Mukhopadhyay, without whose permission this type of program was absolutely impossible. Sir, the Department of Economics is highly indebted to you. You have granted us the very important permission for this particular program. Thank you so much, sir. We'll never forget your cooperation. During the total session, we have marked that there were so many faculty members of our department of our at the same time of different departments of our college. And not only that, so many faculty members of different colleges were also present. We are really privileged. I extend my heartiest thanks to all of you. At the same time, the students of economics of our college and the ex-students were also present. I thank each of you. And last of all, it should be incomplete if I don't extend my thanks to my esteemed colleagues. We have got huge participation, huge inspiration, tremendous support from our esteemed colleagues. I should mention the name of them, our senior most faculty member, Professor Nandita Chakrabarti, another pillar of our department, Professor Jaideep Datta, our junior most faculty member, Srija Patra. Right from the day one, they have taken so wonderful, initiation. And finally, I want to thank our head of the department, very beloved head of the department, Dr. Gargi Basu. Right from the very beginning, she took special initiative to implement this program into a grand success, and she has done it. So thank you so much, Dr. Gargi Basu, for your outstanding cooperation, coordination, as well as your very, very enthusiastic attitude. So that's all from today's program. For your information, I want to say something that within a gap of just, I think, within a gap of just 10 to 12 days, we have been able, our department has been able to conduct two successive, very nice webinars. And in the days to come, we are planning to do such more webinars a lot. So please stay tuned, friends. Please stay tuned with us. We'll once again we'll come back with different programs. Until then, goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. The link for the feedback form is given to you in the chat box. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we are leaving.
Hello. Hello, speaker. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Madam, I wanted to know one thing. What Professor Mukherjee has already delivered, will it be available to us in terms of recordings or something, so that we
Yeah,
can?
the recording will be uploaded in the SC Jaipur College
In our
Economics
departmental
Department.
channel. Yes.
Okay, okay.
YouTube
In the
channel
college
we
website,
uploaded.
in the college website, isn't it?
No,
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 no.
no,
In
it
the
will not be
YouTube, you can
available in
search
college
it on
website.
YouTube.
Or YouTube channel. Okay, okay. Okay. How will be searching that? How will be the next?
Economics Department, Jaipuria College.
Okay, okay, okay. Okay. Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you. গার্গী দি রেকর্ডিংটা স্টপ করে